Hello, BookTube. Long time no see. I'm Heather, and I haven't been around here in a while. I seem to kind of get back on the recording pattern and then drop off very, very quickly. Not entirely sure what the root causes are, so I've been thinking about that lately as I've watched other people kind of start to re-emerge into recording. And it's not because I haven't been reading. I'm reading lots, astonishing number of books, really. Not as many as I read when I was at my most stressed time when I was working and needed like total distraction. So I'm reading less, so fewer books, and so there would be a smaller page count too. Not that either of those things actually matters, but I think I had, I guess, what folks would call a reading slump, but it's not really a reading slump. It's not quite the right term. I found January and February particularly difficult months to get through, and not because the winter was difficult. We actually had a pretty mild winter here after a very mild hurricane season. It was astonishing here. I found the political goings-on in January and February very difficult to work my way through, how to think about them, how to feel about them, how to respond to the horrors that we all keep seeing in Palestine, and the horrors rolling out south of the border, and the threats being directed our way. I mean, that's all very difficult for me, I found that difficult to think my way through. And at the same time, I was reading a lot of nonfiction and fiction coming out of Germany in the mid to late 30s. So I was reading Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a marvelous book to read. She's a very Germanic prose stylist, but her prose is really quite interesting once you get into the rhythm of, okay, she's going to have this long, compound, complex, parallel structure sentence followed by another really zingy sentence. It's quite interesting, and conceptually her works are quite interesting too. And I was reading, what's the title of it? February 1933 by Wittstock. So it's an account of what happened in Germany once Hitler became chancellor and how things rapidly unfolded. And it's a day-by-day account over 3 months, I think it covers, of the accounts of people who decided to leave Germany very quickly and people who did not leave very quickly. And in many cases, the inevitable outcome was their death. And it's got all of these kind of short little vignettes of various cultural figures interspersed with summaries of what happened in the news on that day. So stories of what kind of resistance there was. And most of that resistance was coming from the left in Germany, from the Communist Party. And all these little stories about various assassinations and just the dire things that were happening. So I was reading that at the same time, so Arendt and Wittstock at the same time as I was reading with a group of people four Irmgard Keun novels, also set in the same time period. So I think that amped up my inability to record videos. At the same time, I started watching and reading a lot of news content, just trying to get my head around what was going on, what's likely to happen next, and the bad things are likely to happen next. So I found it very hard to settle back into a routine of recording videos. And I found it difficult to figure out how to talk about books, which is an interesting thing for me to experience. It's a useful thing to experience because all these kind of awkward moments in life are, for me, ultimately useful to have experienced. At one point in my life, I made my living by talking about books. I taught. And it's a very odd experience to realize that I can read a book, enjoy it or not enjoy it, think about how it works structurally, usually as a work of art or a work of nonfiction, and get a lot out of that, but then not be able to articulate what I thought or felt about a book. And I usually tend to lean on the thinking side of reacting to a book rather than the feeling side of the book. So it was an odd experience. I read some really great books, some really so-so books. I'll just maybe talk about a couple of them very, very briefly. I'm finding things I used to read for comfort. So things like mystery novels with my old standby, and occasionally science fiction or fantasy novel. I've been finding them not very satisfying lately. I think I'm picking up the wrong kinds of mystery novels and wrong kinds of fantasy or science fiction. I've been finding them disappointing in their kind of literary shallowness, and genre fiction can be absolutely beautifully written sometimes, and I haven't been happening on those, so I get pretty frustrated with that, and because it takes away easy comfort reading. And I've struggled also with historical fiction lately. I tend to kind of gravitate toward historical fiction that's about it's kind of stuff that's specifically about the place I live or about a period that I understand pretty well, and then lately horrified by what I'm reading. Horrified is too strong a term. Disappointed because simple factual details will be wrong, like very wrong. Like streets that still have the same name and are still actually physically in the same place, being described as being cross streets. You know, a character going to those places and then on someplace else. And those streets do not cross. So those are actually kind of essentially copy editing errors, so that the copy editor did not check against an actual historical map or a current map. And I'm finding those kinds of flaws, not so much as in flaws in the writing, but flaws in copywriting, frustrating me to no end, so that I can't actually talk about the book. I'm sending one back to the library today that I picked up yesterday, the day before, to read. It's a novel about Peggy Guggenheim. Peggy Guggenheim. So it's by Rebecca, what's Rebecca's last name? Godfrey. She died 3 years ago, and I read one of her nonfiction books years ago, decades ago, about the Rena Verk murder in Victoria, which I thought was well done. So I thought this would be interesting to read, and then hadn't really twigged to the fact that it was a posthumous publication and that the book had been incomplete when she died. She'd been working on it for 10 years, and then a friend of hers, Leslie Jameson, collaborated with her husband and took the incomplete novel and finished it. I didn't finish reading the novel. I got to about page 50 or 75, and I'm not a person who puts books down, but I had found 5 or 6 things that I would describe as a failure of copy editing in the text that really popped me out of the fiction. I couldn't sustain the disbelief we all need in order to happily read something. And these would be simple things like character being described going to one library on page 15 and then going back to that library in page 20, but the library's called an entirely different thing, but they're the same actual historical library. Piece of clothing being described in a certain way, but if you know anything about how clothing works, it's not how an empire gown works. The tight part of the gown is typically not over the bust, it's under the bust, and has been that way for more than 200 years. So those kinds of things I'm very impatient with, which means that a lot of contemporary fiction just doesn't cut it for me right now. So I'm turning to stuff that's not contemporary. My list of books that I'm reading that have been published before 2010 is growing and growing and growing. And I'm going to be okay with that for now. And I just have to be okay with it until I stop overreacting to what are essentially copy edit problems. The copy editors need to be stronger at their jobs, as well as the writers need to be stronger at their jobs. But most of these things I would chalk up to copy editing and proofreading errors, that someone just hasn't gone through the book and checked things like timelines and details. So for just distraction reading that's not on any kind of grand list that I might want to accomplish, or not part of a reading group, it's not book that's on a prize list, and let's not talk about prize lists. something that doesn't have a larger goal behind it. Just the kind of reading that mysteries or romances or science fiction or fantasy used to fill for me, I am now filling with memoirs. Short little memoirs, typically by women, and typically ones that were published 10 years ago or more. I think this might become my sweet spot over the summer. At least I hope it will, because it's giving me a more positive reading experience. So the two that I found the most interesting, that I'm most likely to go back and reread, one is by Charles Ritchie. It was the first memoir he published, Siren Years, and it covers 1938 to 1945, and he won the Governor General's Award, I believe, in 77, 76 for this memoir. And I mean, Ritchie can be a bit of a what's the polite term for it? Roving eye, ladies' man, that kind of thing. A man of his generation, I suppose. But he's a lovely prose stylist. His account of life in the Blitz, especially during the period as he's working for the masses, and just in that period when he's falling in love with Elizabeth Bowen and living through the Blitz, dealing with the political machinations of the Canadian government and the Canadian ambassadorial staff, and what's going on in the UK, and what's going to happen or not happen in Europe or at the outcome of the war. I found quite satisfying to read. There's the Blitz stuff is great, but there's also this bit, Dunkirk, I think? Dunkirk? No, D-Day, where Ritchie wrangles his way onto the post-battle location. There's absolutely no need for him to be traveling from London to France in 1944, but he wrangles his way. I think he must have been feeling a little bit of left outness. I mean, he was in his late 30s at that point, so not someone who's likely to be a military man. And it's an extraordinary little account of just what that day or 2 days was like for him to go from jaunts to country houses and the Canadian embassy in London to this short stretch of time in France, and then back. And he's back to North America shortly after that, and in San Francisco for UN conferences, kind of establishing conferences. So that I found a very satisfying read. Ritchie is a great prose stylist. Yeah, and I would love someday for someone to write a real biography of Ritchie, or to publish the unexpurgated diaries. He wrote this memoir up 30 years after the events that occur in it, and he clearly worked it up. It's quite clear that it's been revised and polished and smoothed over, but I'd love to read the non-smoothed over bits if they had survived. Another memoir, which is probably a little bit mermaidy for some people, is Carolyn Heilbrun's last book. So Heilbrun committed suicide when she was 77, shortly after her 77th birthday. She was a literary scholar, and this last book, what's it called? Got some notes here. When Men Were the Only Models We Had. My teachers Barzun, Fadiman, Trilling. So it's an account of her literary education, so high school and university and graduate student studies, and a tiny little bit about her academic career. There's more, I think, about her academic career and the challenges that it posed in The Last Gift. Last Gift, what's the full title of The Last Gift? I'll put it down below. And When Men Were the Only Models We Had is quite a melancholy book, I found. It's quite melancholy and reflective and bitter, I think. Heilbrun came to graduate school at a time when women in graduate schools were still oddities. Women's literature was rarely taught. This is still this way when I was going through graduate school many decades ago. And So you might get one novel by Virginia Woolf on a curriculum and one by Jane Austen, but maybe one by George Eliot. But anything beyond that simply wasn't taught. It was read, but it wasn't taught or seen as part of what graduate students would focus on or what should be promoted or explored rigorously. That's an oversimplification, of course. So while Heilbrun had great admiration and affection for Fadiman, Barzun, and Trilling, they didn't necessarily respond positively to her. I don't think she ever met Fadiman, but Trilling and Barzun were her colleagues at Columbia, and they didn't always respond generously to the idea that women could write well, that women's work was worth exploring, that the shape of women's lives would affect what they wrote and why they wrote, and how we should understand what they wrote and why they wrote what they wrote. So Heilbrun struggled, I think, most of her career against institutionalized misogyny. She graduated from Columbia, 1950s, mid-50s, had a couple of children and taught, and went through the whole tenure track process with very young children, taught full-time, and published some of the key texts in feminist literary scholarship that came out in the late 60s and early 70s. And at the same time, she was writing mystery novels under a pseudonym. Amanda Cross was her pseudonym, and it was quite interesting to read this last, very sad, very bitter, mostly sad, I think, account of how much she had hoped to learn from these men she admired, or who were her teachers or her peers, and how she was very frustrated in the end because they didn't see her as a student who should be engaged with in the same way that her male peers were. They didn't see her as a colleague of some standing. And the internal battles in any academic department are always messy and petty and hard. Messy, petty, and hard is the way I describe some of these battles. They're all foolish. All these battles are foolish. So if you're interested in the lives of academic women in the 70s and 80s, and even in the 60s, you might like to read Carolyn Heilbrun. It's a sad read. If you're just wanting to read something, a memoir by her that covers what it's like to be an older woman and to retire, The Last Gift is probably a better bet. But I found that last memoir quite interesting. I'll try to be back in a little while, maybe next week sometime. I don't know. Don't know whether I'll do a to-be-read video. I usually have poor luck defining a to-be-read pile and then actually reading what I've said I'm going to read, and I don't usually do hauls because almost all of my reading comes from the public library or the university library, and I'm a little reluctant to talk in any detail about the books that I'm reading with a reading group, but you never know. There's lots of books in the world to read, and I'm just going to find my way through them. I'm going to avoid contemporary fiction for a while, going to avoid my usual comfort reads and lean more heavily into memoirs, I think. Memoirs and diaries and letters, I think, is probably going to do it for me. I hope you're well, and I hope you're having much better reading time than I've been having. Bye-bye.